Since 2024, France has provided Ukraine with Mirage 2000 fighter jets and SKA cruise missiles, and has continued to provide various types of military assistance. France aims to use Ukraine to contain Russia and thereby weaken its international influence. In July of this year, French President Emmanuel Macron again targeted China, publicly threatening that if Beijing continued to purchase Russian oil, China would face tariffs of up to 500%. To achieve this goal, France also planned to join forces with the EU and the US to pressure China. However, China ignored France's threats and instead increased its oil purchases from Russia by 2.5 million tons. This move directly infuriated France, but they have no real leverage to counter China. In desperation, France once again targeted Russia, threatening further sanctions on its oil exports and banking sector if Russia does not agree to an unconditional ceasefire with Ukraine. This raises the question, is France trying to prevent China from purchasing Russian oil? If they actually impose a 500% tariff on China, will this have any impact on China? If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now, let's get into today's topic. The Russo-Ukrainian War, which broke out in February 2022, has raged for over 3 years. The conflict has exacted an extremely heavy toll on both sides and has had widespread impacts on the global economy. Energy and food supply chains have been disrupted, with global wheat prices rising 120% compared to pre-war levels. A sharp drop in Russian neon exports has also caused global chip prices to soar 47%. These changes have directly impacted the daily lives of ordinary people. To maintain global stability, the United Nations has repeatedly attempted to mediate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. However, despite numerous rounds of negotiations, no substantial progress has been made. This is due to irreconcilable differences on core issues such as territorial sovereignty, security guarantees, and sanctions relief. Coupled with the deep involvement of Western countries, each negotiation ultimately reached a stalemate. But how could Ukraine, a small country far less powerful than Russia, sustain such a prolonged war? Because Ukraine is not fighting alone. It has the full support of numerous Western countries. Since 2022, Western countries have been increasing their aid to Ukraine, with support from the United States and Europe being particularly significant. According to the latest U.S. congressional budget, the U.S. approved over $40 billion in aid last year. The European Union has also decided to provide 40 billion euros in military aid to Ukraine in 2025, and the UK has pledged 4.5 billion pounds. To further enhance Ukraine's combat drone capabilities, the EU has facilitated joint production between the UK's defense industry and Ukrainian frontline drone factories. With strong support from the US and EU, Ukraine naturally has more confidence to confront Russia head-on. From the perspective of Western countries, they welcome this situation, using Ukraine's proxy war to weaken Russia's international power and influence. However, the situation is now subtly shifting. In May of this year, the French government announced a 500% tariff on all countries purchasing Russian oil. In my view, this policy is also directly aimed at China, intended to prevent China from continuing to purchase Russian oil. As far as I know, China, as one of the world's largest oil importers, imports large quantities of oil annually from multiple countries, including Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and Iraq. Of course, as a strategic partner of China, Russia is also a key supplier. In 2024, China's total crude oil imports will be approximately 553 million tons, of which 108 million tons, nearly 1/5, will come from Russia. China is also Russia's largest buyer. By the first half of 2025, China's crude oil imports from Russia will be approximately 42 million tons, accounting for 3.8% of total imports during the same period. These data also indirectly demonstrate that China and Russia have maintained a very close relationship in energy cooperation. At this time, in order to prevent China from purchasing Russian oil, France even attempted to enlist the United States in an attempt to force China to stop purchasing oil from Russia through tariffs. However, the United States was completely unconvinced and even considered France's actions pointless. The United States has long launched various tariff wars against China, hoping to force concessions from China. But what was the result? At that time, tariffs between China and the United States even soared to 245%, but failed to sway China. Ultimately, the United States and China had to sit down and negotiate. So it's clear that the 500% tariff proposed by France will not force China to yield. But what's even more ironic is that France secretly bought 19 million barrels of oil from Russia last year, yet now wants to prevent China from buying Russian oil. This is pure double standard behavior. Ironically, while France was still clamoring for a 500% tariff on China, China had already signed a massive oil deal with Russia worth over $1 billion. Under the agreement, China would purchase an additional 2.5 million tons of oil annually, building on its existing Sino-Russian oil cooperation, meaning an average of approximately 7,000 tons more oil shipped daily. This deal perfectly aligns with Russian President Vladimir Putin's statement: "We can provide as much oil as China needs." Russia pledged to fully meet all of China's oil needs. More importantly, the 100 million tons of oil orders already completed between China and Russia have all been settled in RMB. Currently, RMB settlement accounts for over 60% of transactions on the Moscow exchange. Of course, China's continued large-scale purchases of Russian oil have, to a certain extent, helped ease Russia's economic pressure. Western countries have long sought to weaken Russia's economic strength, and sanctions on Russian oil are a crucial step in this process. Consider this: Russia, a world-renowned resource-rich country with among the world's largest oil reserves, has long relied on oil sales to generate foreign exchange and support its domestic economy and development. If the West were to completely block Russian oil exports, it would inevitably lead to a complete collapse of the entire oil supply chain, from extraction, refining, and transportation, responsible for businesses facing bankruptcy and widespread unemployment. More seriously, if this chain reaction intensifies, it could trigger a fiscal crisis, leading to problems like the government's inability to pay wages and rising debt risks. Against this backdrop, French President Emmanuel Macron has also threatened to impose further sanctions, targeting Russia's oil exports and banking system, if Russia does not agree to an unconditional ceasefire with the intention of completely crushing the Russian economy. Their calculation is clear: to use economic pressure to force Russia to make concessions in the Russo-Ukrainian war. However, this tactic has not been effective. Russia has the support of strategic partners like China. Even if China does not buy Russian oil, it is likely to provide support in other key areas, helping Russia alleviate the pressure of various Western sanctions. However, I believe France's threat to impose a 500% tariff on China could also be retaliatory. As early as January 2024, several Chinese brandy producers filed a complaint with the Ministry of Commerce, alleging that EU brandy was being dumped in the Chinese market at below-cost prices. This caused the EU brandy market share to soar from 43% in 2019 to 52% in 2023, severely squeezing the survival of Chinese domestic wine producers. Subsequently, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce conducted an in-depth investigation lasting a year and a half, ultimately confirming dumping of 27.7% to 34.9% of EU brandy and formally imposed anti-dumping duties under the anti-dumping regulations. These tariffs will be in effect for 5 years. While 3 well-known French brands were exempted due to their commitment to adhere to minimum prices, other EU companies were subject to a 34.9% tariff. French production accounts for 98% of EU brandy exports to China, and China is France's second-largest export market. Therefore, these countermeasures dealt a heavy blow to the French wine industry. The entire industry lost approximately $60 million per month, and even Pernod Ricard, the world's largest brandy producer, saw its market value evaporate by a full $1 billion on the day the tariffs were announced. In an effort to regain access to the Chinese market, France had previously sent representatives to China's Ministry of Commerce several times, attempting to have China remove its tariffs on brandy, but to no avail. This was not until May of this year when China and France held a meeting in Paris. During the talks, France again proposed an agreement to remove tariffs on brandy and requested China's signature. However, China ignored this request, arguing that France had violated Chinese law. If France were to be exempted from tariffs at this point, other countries would likely follow suit, putting China in a difficult position. Consequently, France began to woo other countries, preparing to jointly impose punitive tariffs of up to 500% on China. This trade dispute is likely an extension and retaliation of the brandy tariff incident. However, the question is, would France's imposition of 500% punitive tariffs truly pose a threat to China? Over the past 60 years, total trade between China and France has increased over 800-fold, and the two sides have maintained close cooperation on economic development. Data indicates that France is highly dependent on Chinese imports of high-performance materials such as specialty polyamides, fluorinated gases and polymers, and industrial gases. In 2024 alone, France's total imports from China exceeded $9 billion, including $3.2 billion in pharmaceuticals and over $4.3 billion in spices. Furthermore, France is one of China's largest pork export markets. In 2023, Chinese pork exports to France reached $300 million, demonstrating the close ties between the two countries in agricultural trade. If France does decide to raise tariffs on Chinese products, the impact on China will be minimal. With a population of 1.4 billion, China is fully capable of absorbing this production capacity through its domestic market. Furthermore, China's trading partners extend beyond France, so there's no need for undue concern. However, the situation is different for France. Losing access to cheap, practical goods from China will inevitably lead to a rise in the cost of living for the French people. If they seek alternatives from other countries, not only will the costs likely be higher than in China, but the quality of the products is also uncertain. To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.